Hey you guys, it's Mike Blackstone with Taking Flight, and I'm reporting out here from London on the 15th of June. It's Father's Day 2025, and you know it's about noontime here, and I'm reporting on the Air India crash 171 that has taken the lives of nearly 300 people in the Ahmedabad, India area. This is just the most devastating crash that aviation has seen in a really long time, and the loss of a 787-800 aircraft with 242 people on board shortly after takeoff is just really heartbreaking. And my heart goes out literally to all of the victims of this terrible aviation accident. And I know everyone's mourning, and we just want to get to the bottom of this incident and find out what happened. And a lot of different speculations and theories are out there, and I don't want to add to any confusion, but I've done a lot of thought on this, and I've done some research, as well as deployed some technical data that I think might be useful to helping us get to a more clear understanding of what might have happened. And these are of course my own personal opinions, and I've been flying for a lot of years. I'm a pilot on the 777, so I don't have any experience on the 787 per se, but I have a lot of experience on Boeing aircraft over the last 26 years, flying jets all over the world. And from London, it's quite chilling to be here this afternoon. And this is where that airplane was supposed to arrive a couple days ago. It took off on June 12th around 1 p.m. from Ahmedabad, India, on a very hot 37-degree day. And I just checked the weather today, and it's about 34 degrees centigrade, which is nearly 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Extremely hot at an airport that's only about 200 feet above sea level. It makes the airplane perform much more poorly, and we'll get into that in just another couple of minutes. But this is just a really big wake-up reminder of how close the margins are on some of these hot heavy takeoffs in big jets. And the crew, I'm sure, did the best they could, but there's definitely some recency of experience and flight times and types of aircraft that make a difference. And I'm a fairly new 777 pilot with less than 1,000 hours total time on the triple. And you take a while. It takes a while to get super comfortable with all of its capabilities, or lack thereof, in different regimes and different altitudes and different weights and all of that. And I'm super cautious. So when you see a situation like this, I'm going to go to the airport diagram here with you and take a look at what they were dealing with. From that airport, it's kind of unusual. There's an international terminal, located in the midfield, slightly southwest of the midfield point of runway 23, which is the runway that they were using that day. But what's interesting is as I read through the airport notes, is that as they taxi out on Papa to the northeast, the taxiway doesn't go all the way to the end of the runway at runway 23. And a lot of airports do not have the funds to have parallel taxiways and multiple runways, and you can kind of see that they do not have any other runways that would point southwesterly. So this is the only runway, and it's 11,499 feet long. But the runway, taxiway rather, stops at a spot called Romeo 4. And what you need to do at this airport is to taxi out onto the active taxiway, which may be being used for takeoffs and landings. And they note that you will taxi at a minimum speed of 25 knots in order to not tangle up that runway for a lot of time, but you'll back taxi to the northeast on to runway essentially 5, go up to these turnout points that have like a little bubble to swing the nose gear into, so you can make a quick right and then a 180 left back out onto the active runway to take off, leaving different lengths of runway, so essentially intersection takeoffs. Now, we don't know for sure whether Flight 171 used that first turnout, which from the diagram reference pages talk about how much runway is available from that point. And if you use that first turnout point, it leaves 9,000 feet. So if you use that first turnout point that you could make and double back and take off with a shortened runway from runway 23, you'd have 8,999 feet available. I don't feel they did that, and hopefully they didn't, but that would really affect the available runway length and make it very, very tight, where there would be no margin for error at the far end of the runway. Judging from the footage that I saw, and we all saw, you see the 787 rotating and a little bit of dust cloud at the far end, which shows that they were rotating and getting airborne very, very close to the end of the runway, which is indicative of the use of that point, that they may have opted to expedite and make the quick U-turn and blast off, taking a full 9,000 feet to get airborne. Now, if I was flying the triple out of there, I certainly would opt to use the full length, but on that hot of a day, with the normal flap setting for a cooler day at a lower pressure altitude airport, such as a sea level airport with a nice cool temperature, flaps 5 would be a normal takeoff flap setting for a triple at sea level. But on a hot temperature day, the appropriate safer flap setting would have been 15. And I believe it would have been the same for the 787, to use flaps 15 and full length from 450,000 pounds, which would have been an approximate weight. I don't know their weight, and I don't have their takeoff data, so we're kind of guesstimating here. And I know there's some assumptions that we're going to have to make here, but from what we see in the video, it looks like a very heavyweight takeoff at or near its within about 50,000 pounds of its max gross weight, takeoff weight. And what we see with the rotation point at the far end is indicative of a shortened runway situation, possibly that 9,000 foot point. But even if they were to have taken off from the full length, which would have given them 11,499 feet, had they made a perfect turn and used every foot of that runway, and then went ahead and used maximum power, which we would have done on a 37 degrees centigrade day, which is kind of what we tell the airplane that we're going to do on a much cooler day when we have lighter weights and favorable winds and various other factors, shorter routes. We would tell the airplane, hey, we are going to take off with 40 degrees centigrade, and tell the airplane to go ahead and take that 10 to 13% power reduction, essentially a derated takeoff, to reduce the engine wear and temperature on the airplane. So it's not unsafe to take off with a reduced power when the conditions are adequate for that. In this particular day, if the plane's power already is reduced because you're at 37 degrees centigrade, the engines, which are, I believe, the 63,000 pound of thrust per side engines on the 787-800, correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, I'm sure you will, it's already reduced because of the high temperature and the pressure altitude. Millibars was 1001, so it had low pressure, which reduces the air density, which reduces the thrust and the lift capability of this aircraft. Let's remember, guys and gals, the performance of any air-breathing jet is significantly affected by the temperature and pressure. And even though we like to think, we've got these 60,000 pound, in my case, I've got 115,000 pounds of thrust per side at sea level at a normal, 59 degrees centigrade. That's its rated thrust on a standard day and pressure and temperature. But most of the days are different than that. So the thrust does decrease significantly, and not just a little. We're talking a huge reduction, and it's about an 8,000 pound thrust reduction per engine at this temperature and pressure, and had just very light winds of about 7 knot headwind approximately when they took off. So I went ahead and ran some analysis using AI, and it lies. So sometimes it does tell us the wrong thing, but it is able to calculate potential factors that we aren't able to calculate without being on that flight and having takeoff performance data available to us, which we do not have. So what we do have are assumptions and approximations of how much runway does it take to get a 787 airborne at 37C at 1001 from this airport at about 200 feet above sea level, with the power wide open, with the full throttle takeoff thrust. Let's give the pilots the benefit of the doubt. They may have made mistakes, and we are human. We all could have made mistakes here, so I'm not blaming pilots at all here. We're all human. We could make mistakes at any point along the way. But when you have a certain amount of flight time, be it 8,000 hours or so, which is what the captain apparently had, total time. And in my career, 8,000 hours happened a long time ago. Where we are in our career depends on the experiences that we've had, and if we haven't had any terrible experiences or scary experiences in our careers, we don't know what we don't know. So I don't know whether or not he's ever experienced anything like this, but it's possible he hadn't, and it's possible they did hit a bird on takeoff. There are bird warnings in the NOTAMs and in the airport pages to watch out for birds, and you could hit a bird on any flight, and there are thousands and thousands of bird strikes along the way. Could you hit a bird and just be a startle? Could you hear something, smell something, and it startle you, even though it didn't destroy the engine? The startle of hitting something certainly could be a distraction, which could have caused a human error, which I'll get to in a minute here. But let's assume that they did everything right here. They took off from runway 23 with full length, 11,499 feet available, full power, and flaps 15. But an appropriate flap setting for this aircraft and for the triple would be a flaps 5 setting. So the plane will not scream out at you if you used flaps 5 and had numbers for flaps 5, because that's an appropriate flap setting. If you have something other than an appropriate takeoff flap setting, like say flaps, triple only has flaps 5, like in a 7.3, you could take off flaps 1, and the plane will not scream at you if you're taking off on a runway that requires flaps 25, say in Orange County, California. You use flaps 1, and the plane doesn't know that that's not a long enough runway to use flaps 1. So sometimes the config warning can help you, sometimes it doesn't know, right? So I believe the 777 and the 787 aircraft have, well, I know for sure we have a config warning if we do not have the flap set for takeoff, but the 787 sometimes has, I believe, it knows what airport it's at, and it would know what flap setting would be appropriate. So is it possible to take off from runway 23 with flaps 5, which is barely adequate at best, and leaves very little margin, if any, for a perfect takeoff with 2 engines? If you hit something or lose power or slight power on one engine, the margins are barely adequate and may not be at all, right? So you can't make that mistake, and that's a pilot choice, and a dispatcher would give us the data and the takeoff performance data to say, hey, this is what the margins look like. Are you comfortable with that, Captain? And you would say, yeah, that's not good. Let's give me new numbers for flaps 15. I want to get more lift out of the wing, and I'm still going to use max thrust. So is it possible they took off with flaps 5? Yes, it is. And it may be legal. It is not safe. Let's put it that way on that runway that day. An appropriate flap setting would have been 15. What we are seeing in the video, the flaps are very low, very little flap hanging down. I don't believe they took off with 15. At best, it was flaps 5. And when I ran this calculation using AI, it talks about with the 37 degrees centigrade with 1001 hectopascals at full rated power, what would happen if they took off flaps 5 and everything was going fine and didn't hit any birds at all, just got airborne barely, and this thing's staggering out. And with a new co-pilot, and a co-pilot with 1,000 hours total time, let's be realistic here, is not a lot of time. If you flew 172s for 500 hours and became a CFI and then went to the airlines at 700 hours and had 250 hours of multi, and now you're in the right seat of a 787 Dreamliner, let's face it, that's not a lot of time, and without a lot of experience in heavy jets at these weights, at these temperatures, and so on. So the captain was essentially solo out there, as far as I could tell. And if he was taking the leg, which I would assume he would on a critical runway like this, on a temperature like this, at a weight such as a max gross weight or max takeoff weight out of this airport on runway 23, let's say the captain took the takeoff, and it looks like they broke ground very close to the end. So did it take 11,500 feet to get airborne with flaps 5? That's pretty crazy. That's the longest takeoff roll I've ever seen or ever heard of. I believe it looks like they took off from the 9,000 foot mark approximately, or maybe something in between. And this thing had very stagnant, slow acceleration, even wide open, and they rotated very close to the end of the runway, and it looks to me like they barely cleared the fence. I could be wrong, but it looks to me like they barely cleared the fence. And if you just barely cleared the fence, and the pucker factor of that, as everyone's eyeballs are big at the end of the runway, throttle wide open and barely clearing the fence, you're thinking, are we heavier than we should be? Are we not making the thrust we think we should be? Is the throttle's wide open, you push the throttle up and hit the stops and you're there. And then you call out to your trusty co-pilot and say, gear up. Even though the co-pilot may have missed the positive rate call because it wasn't much of a positive rate at all, they barely cleared the fence, and they never got a great positive rate, but they did get to 400 feet approximately above the ground, which definitely got some kind of a positive rate, got some kind of a climb. Nobody apparently said the magic words to trigger the gear up call, which is positive rate, gear up, and that needs to happen within a few seconds, and in most takeoffs within 100 feet or so of the ground, somebody's calling positive rate to get the wheels up, to get those big, giant, drag-producing landing gear out of the airflow so we can get the plane accelerating, to get more airflow over the wings to make more lift so we can climb. That didn't happen here. The fact that they crashed within a mile of the airport, I believe the impact was about 9/10 of a mile to the southwest of the airport, shows me that about that length of time, the seconds it takes from just above the ground, say 50 feet above the runway, the gear should have been coming up. And if the captain called, if he didn't hear it, positive rate, gear up, and the co-pilot went from flaps 5 to flaps up, and it takes a while for these flaps to move. They're not super fast. it seems it's about the right amount of time for these flaps to go from flaps 5 to flaps up. And no matter how much thrust you're making, throttles wide open, that would not be adequate to get this airplane to climb at 140, 160 knots with the flaps up. You're behind the power curve. The rat was deployed. Did the rat come out because of a dual engine failure, or did the pilot deploy it manually? And in the triple, we have a button that we can push to deploy the rat manually. And maybe in a last-ditch effort, the captain might have reached up and deployed the rat manually, thinking he's lost the engines, and when in fact they're just not able to make enough thrust to climb, even if they were wide open. I didn't see any birds activity in that area, not to say there wasn't one or two or a few hanging around, and maybe they did take a bird down one of the engines, and maybe it did make a bang, and maybe we didn't get a puff of smoke or see any sparks or damage coming out of either of the engines. And these engines are designed to take birds and to continue to run, so it is possible that at or near V1, which is the speed that you're committed to the takeoff, that they hit a bird, delayed the rotation, rotated at the far end, and got airborne with an engine that had been struck by a bird, but still producing thrust. And that is totally possible. Now, the startle factor of hitting a bird at high speed on a high density altitude day with a high temperature, such as what they had on the 12th of June, might have been enough to startle them into getting out of their flow, out of their normal routine, which would be positive rate gear up, and struggle to get airborne, knowing that they hit something. That could happen, and human beings have this startle factor there. And if you've never hit a bird before, and you've never had one, go into the engine and then smell the chicken burning and going through, if it went into the left engine, it would have gone into the left pack, which means the pilots would have smelled some chicken going through the engine. And that might have been enough, maybe a little puff of smoke in the cockpit, just enough to distract them, to get them to miss the put the gear up call. And then he wanted to get clean and possibly put the flaps up instead of the gear, and that totally could have happened. And that's what I'm seeing at this point. The AI profile that I have, I'll read it to you here, to kind of compare what could have happened. And this is the scenario that I put in, was a 787 at 450,000 pounds, 37C, 1001 on the hectopascals, flaps 5, with a 9,000 foot runway from Victor Alpha Alpha Hotel at 189 feet above sea level with a 7-knot headwind. A bird strike during takeoff, roll, or at rotation, like V1 bird strike. Could the crew fail to raise the gear or accidentally retract the flaps instead? And what would be the outcome of that? And it says at number 1, a bird strike effect on one or both engines shortly after V1. The modern engine that the airplane has, a GE NX-1 Bravo, certified to survive an ingestion of a medium-sized bird with no flame out. But severe ingestion can lead to loss of thrust or surge, vibrations, compressor stall, partial or total engine failure. Okay, with the margins that close, any kind of bird strike, even on one engine, would have degraded the performance significantly enough to be catastrophic. Even just partial thrust loss with the gear still hanging down. Number 2, cockpit task load after the strike. Immediately after liftoff, the crew must maintain pitch for V2 plus whatever you have. Don't let the speed roll back. Excuse me. Identify if engine damage or fire occurred, which we didn't see any fire at the back, and maybe one had started or overheated or some kind of engine surge or indication in the cockpit. Even though we couldn't see anything on the outside, doesn't mean that they didn't have a distraction on the inside as well. So that is certainly a distraction factor. Raise the gear to reduce the drag. Maintain heading and positive rate of climb. With visual auditory overload, startle factor, and possible master cautions, it is plausible that a pilot could mistakenly raise flaps instead of the gear if they're startled or disoriented. Flaps and gear levers are physically distinct. A flap handle is shaped like a flap and a gear handle is shaped like a wheel. But if both pilots are overwhelmed, misidentification can happen, especially if there's smoke in the cockpit, vibration, or cockpit noise, which they may have had that for sure. If they go with the number 3, flaps up instead of gear up, this is the critical error. If retracting flaps 5 to flaps up immediately after liftoff, massive drop in lift. You'd start to get a high sink rate. Drag remains high because the gear is still down. Aircraft is already thrust limited. It's already performing with 8,000 pounds less thrust per side, even with the throttles wide open at max takeoff thrust. The net result, aircraft may stop climbing or descend. Combined factors, number 4 says a bird strike, startle, distraction, possible thrust loss. The gear not raised, high drag continues to persist. Flaps retracted early, loss of lift, the climb collapses. At 37 degrees C, the thrust is degraded 11 to 13%. At the high gross weight of 450,000 pounds, you have marginal performance at best. Likely outcome, with bird strike or distraction, if the gear is not raised and flaps are mistakenly retracted, the 787-800 would struggle to maintain altitude. It would enter marginal or negative climb, which is what we see in the video. Possible settle back to the ground if no correction is made within 5 to 10 seconds. And a collision with terrain or structures or the end of the runway overrun zone is highly probable. And because this accident happened within a mile of the airport, that appears to be what we see here, unfortunately. Especially with full fuel and passengers, the aircraft has almost no margin. Under these conditions, recovery would require recognizing the flap error immediately, restoring flaps settings, if possible, put them back out to 5. Dumping fuel is not an option at this altitude. Maximum control skill and airmanship required to survive. So the final answer, it says, is yes. If a bird strike distracts the pilots and they mistakenly raise the flaps instead of the gear under these high weight, high temperature, and performance limited conditions, a crash is highly likely, even if both engines remain running. Let's face it, guys, the performance of these aircraft, these are not jet fighters out here. You know, they are heavy, and the thrust to weight ratio is, you know, like 0.28 pounds of thrust per pound of weight. We don't have a massive amount of excess thrust, even in these big jets. It requires very careful planning and requires very precise aircraft airmanship to fly them and handle them properly. And most of what I find as I fly the bigger, heavier airplanes is it's about head work. It's about good planning. It's about good preparation and thinking through all the possibilities before you get out onto the runway. And this is one of those situations that require that excellent head work. So I appreciate your time. Hopefully this is helpful to you, and we can all, you know, get to the bottom of this sooner. What's really going to be critical in this investigation are the cockpit voice recorder conversations, and we need to hear what switches were moved. The sound of a flap is very, very distinctive. A metallic clunking sound as the handle moves through gates and into deep notches, so you would hear a very hard metal click as the flap handles moved, versus a very soft sound of a landing gear handle moving up is much quieter and more of an electric switch versus a mechanical clunk. We'll hear whether or not, as that airplane got airborne, whether they reached for the gear handle or the flap handle. And I believe obviously the gear were still down, but did they try to move them and they didn't move? That's extremely unlikely. I haven't heard of any times when a pilot went to reach for a gear handle and the gear did not come up as commanded. That's extremely low probability in a Boeing for that to happen. It's more likely that they reach for the flap handle instead, and it's unfortunate that that might have happened during a startle factor of maybe they hit something, or maybe they just made a mistake, and that is certainly not out of the question here. So my prayers again go out to all of those lost. I believe we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 people have perished as a result of this incident, and it's just devastating. And we hope that this never happens again, and we all can learn something from this. So my name is Mike Blackstone, and you're watching Taking Flight. I look forward to finding out what really happened on the cockpit voice recorder, and find out whether or not those engines had any damage to them, which could have happened, but it would not be necessary to have damage to those engines for this to happen, unfortunately. So stay safe out there, guys. Keep on flying, and know that we're doing everything we can to keep you safe as we fly these airplanes all over the world. Bye-bye.